So this is one of those 3 arc episodes where it just kind of weaves back and forth between them throughout the episode, and we see how they kind of interweave as we go through the episode, the ways that 3 different plots go through. One, of course, is the Minister of Peace, primarily centered around Zack, actually, of all people. One of them is the plot about the first ones, and one of them is the much more side plot about G'Kar. I'm going to start talking about G'Kar, and then I'm going to talk about the first ones, and then I'm going to talk about the Minister Beast. G'Kar is interesting in the way he approaches the 2 people he approaches in this episode, because he's trying to figure out what's going on. G'Kar is smart. I mean, we've already established this. This is Season 3. We know G'Kar has a brain by this point in time. And he has a fairly large amount of political experience, especially for a Narn, and especially amongst how the alien races work. Alien to Narn, I mean. So, he's pretty much right on the money when he calls out Delenn, and the way he approaches her is very political. He approaches her as a fellow member of politics, a fellow counselor or member or whatever. What I find most interesting about that is not only that he's putting the pieces together quite expertly, but the next person he hits is Garibaldi, right? And he starts off with kind of a, what's going on, and Garibaldi says, nope, and then he drops all of it. Now, this is interesting to me for 2 reasons. First of all, G'Kar very rarely drops all pretenses and is just honest. It does happen here and there, and it's nice to see it whenever it happens, but most of the time, I mean, you remember G'Kar in Season 1 where he was constantly playing the politician, right? As if, and there was some deliberate meta aspect to that, where the audience was supposed to believe that he was just another, bad guy like Katsulas usually plays. And then he was slowly fleshed out over time. But he drops everything because it's Garibaldi, which leads me to the second reason this is interesting. Garibaldi is the one who came to him and said, you can't smuggle weapons through here. And G'Kar was like, you're right. And even though it would cost G'Kar, and even though it was horrible, he admitted, you're right, we can't. So he told Garibaldi the truth. He dropped pretenses, and he told Garibaldi the truth. And you remember what happened? It paid off. Garibaldi turned around and repaid that truth and said, you got it. Here's somewhere else you can smuggle them. That episode was an extremely... Actually, there was 3 episodes around that era. I called this out when we were going through the Ruminations, about how G'Kar was learning of the benefits of playing it the non-Narn way. Because that's not the Narn way of doing things, really, and we've seen this many times. But he had been learning the benefits of cooperation with the other races, specifically with Delenn, Garibaldi, and Sheridan. All 3 of these people he had basically learned were his allies, and were trying to help him, and he wanted to reach out to them and do what he could in that stead. So we see here, he reaches out to Delenn, and they're in a public place, so he keeps on the facade. And I think, personally, that's why he does it. Not because it's Delenn, not because he's approaching her as a politician, but because they're in public, and this is his first foray into figuring out. And they're not willing to tell him, okay. But when he hits Garibaldi, he drops everything and just says, look, I know something's going on. And Garibaldi, true to Garibaldi, hits him right back with the truth. If I knew anything that could help your people, I would be letting you know. And that's the truth. Because from Garibaldi's perspective, and from the perspective of most of the people of the Circle, the Army of Light, none of this is going to help the Narn. At least not in the short term. They're concerned with fighting the large war against the Shadows. And I've always had the impression and the opinion, and maybe this is wrong, that they don't really understand the full connection between the Shadows of the Centauri right now. That they don't understand how much the Shadows have influenced several pieces of the board. In other words, the characters, don't know what we, the viewers, know. After all, we do hear Mr. Morden's voice on that recording talking to Vice President Clark during this episode, don't we? And we already saw him interacting with the Cyclops, right? So we know the Shadows have their fingers in a lot of pots, but the characters don't. Or, if they do, they're only beginning to suspect how deeply the Shadows run, if you will. So I believe Garibaldi when he says, if I knew anything, I'd be telling you. I would try to be helping your people. If anything, it is my opinion Garibaldi, and probably some of the others, but most especially Garibaldi, is deliberately keeping G'Kar out of things because this isn't his problem. He's got his own problems, and they don't want to burden him with theirs. And then G'Kar does something very, very interesting. It might be the first time we've seen G'Kar do a genuine act of friendship. Just friendship. Not back and forth, not trade-off, not I cooperate with you in your way so you cooperate with me in my way. Just giving. He says to Garibaldi, maybe I can help you. And Garibaldi says, quite honestly, I don't see how that's possible. And G'Kar says, maybe you should think about that. And he comes in the middle of the night and offers him the Book of G'Quan. Now, I know that was supposed to be a humorous scene. It's very clearly shot as a humorous scene. But think about that for just a moment. Think about how important that book is to G'Kar. That's already been well established. All the way back in Season 1, we knew how important that book was, and the teachings of G'Quan were to G'Kar. And that has been re-emphasized and re-emphasized and re-emphasized over and over and over, especially in a somewhat recent episode, if you'll remember, where he actually saw evidence of the shadows in that book. So that book, his personal copy of the G'Quan, is a very important thing to him, and he gifts this to Garibaldi. This is significant for two very important reasons, especially because he's a Narn and a very proud person, regardless, in addition to being a Narn. Giving something that personal to someone, and the idea that it might help him in his larger problem. G'Kar's not an idiot. He knows this has to do with the shadows. He does. He saw the signs forever ago. He was the first one to see the signs, actually, remember? He had that wonderful speech, I forget the episode, but he had that wonderful speech about how none of the various races would make the strike that was made against his people. No one else had the will, the interest, or the power to do it, and there was a new player on the board. He put that puzzle together almost immediately. Good stuff, as always. Let's talk about Ivanova. You know, I've noticed that when people tend to quote Babylon 5, they most often quote Ivanova quotes, you know, like the Monty Python style thing where you always quote, you know, a particular thing because it's humorous, you know, or with a humorous slant. Her speech towards the beginning about how, oh, yes, no, I'm surprises. What surprise was something, you know, I've got a cut on my finger, but some people would be annoyed by that, but me, it's just another surprise, so maybe you can't be bothered by me surprised. You know? She gets all the quotable lines is what I'm trying to say. Like, seriously, so many quotable lines are given to her. Not that I complain. She does a good job of it. It's just interesting how many of those are given to her, especially since later in this episode, she's given another wonderful quotable line. Good luck, Captain. I think you're about to go where everyone has gone before. So, a couple little just side notes that occurred to me. It's got to be weird. This episode does kind of highlight how weird it is to be someone who regularly doesn't exist within their own body, but still has a body. As he's like, all right, just enter the thing. Oh, I'm still in it. I'm so sorry. And then he gets out of it. He's like, oh, God, I've got dust on me. Note to self, dust self from time to time. The problems of not being in your own body, am I right? I mean, I wouldn't know anything about that. I do have an odd question. And I understand why for a plot purpose, but maybe I missed it. Please feel free to correct me on this. I didn't see any reasoning given for why it had to be, well, originally it was supposed to be Sheridan, but why it had to be Ivanova to reach out. Yawn attack. I'm so tired. To reach out through the machine. Why did it have to be a human? Now, you could argue that it had to be a human because it's their war. They're the ones reaching out. They're the ones who need the help, right? But draws a Membari. I mean, he's arguably becoming less Membari by the minute. And in fact, I like how you kind of see how his perspective is drifting into more and more alien mentality because of the way he talks and the way he functions. And, I mean, that's going to happen to anybody who doesn't live in their body most of the time. But, seriously though, why didn't he just reach out to the first ones? Why did he need their help on that one? I mean, there are answers to this question, I just don't recall them being given. This isn't like a plot hole, per se. I do think it's clever writing. Not the fact that Sheridan needed to do it. That's something that needs to be explained. But the fact that Ivanova had to do it, that was well written. And why was Ivanova so important to that? One of the things we know about Ivanova, and is reinforced in this episode, just in case you think this is a misrepresentation, is that she's constantly keeping herself busy because of how many emotional and mental issues she has. As an aside, I love how Marcus just cuts right through all of her masks, straight down to the core of the issue, immediately. Now, in fairness, he probably had a couple hours of observation to manage that, and days, actually. He's been around her for a while. But still, that is very Marcus. But I'll talk more about Marcus in just a second. So it is part of her character to be the kind of person who, for example, dwells on things. What is her first thought when she sees the Earth Force One situation? Her first thought isn't, oh God, I'm about to witness a tragedy. It's not, maybe I could find out what actually happened. It's, I can warn them. I can save them. I pointed out all the way back when that first happened that Ivanova was the one hit hardest by that. You remember that? And you remember why I said it was her that was hit hardest by it? It's because she felt powerless. She herself calls this out. She felt like there was nothing she could do about the circumstance, and that bothered her. And I bet it has never stopped bothering her up until this moment. Because again, what's the first thing she says? I can do something about this. Learning that she can't probably drove her just a little bit more despairing until she just happened to catch that little signal between Clark and Morden. Now, some people have called that out for being a little bit, Deus Ex-y, but I don't actually agree. I mean, you could argue that it's more or less a literal Deus Ex Machina because she's in this giant machine, but what I mean by that is I think that's an example of good writing because all the pieces were put into place. We know Mr. Morden is a hell of a manipulator. He's not the kind of person who walks up and hits you with a hammer. That's the Shadow's job. He's the manipulator. He's the schemer. He's the one doing the political plots. He's been working through Londo. He's been working through Rifa. We know this by now. He's been working through Clark's administration, if not Clark personally. The news that he's working with Clark isn't really a big revelation. It's just another layer of his manipulations. But here's the really important part. She was seeking old people, first ones they call them, but she was seeking information from the old ones, right? And then she accidentally stumbles onto the Shadows. Now, I don't think this is a spoiler to say this, because they say this flat out. I mean, we know the Shadows are among the first ones. We know they're some of the older races, like the Vorlons, like all the other older races, right? I know that there's... Those of you who know Babylon 5 know that there's actually a specific first ones, which applies to these guys, and then first ones, which applies to these guys. It's actually two terms, which are used kind of interchangeably, which does make it a little confusing. But you get my point. The Shadows are, in the umbrella term, first ones, right? So it's logical that she would encounter the Shadows, because she was seeking first ones. And then, she finds something Shadow-related on that incident. An incident that was very heavily on her mind. In a machine that can do the kind of scanning it does. You see where I'm going with this? I don't think it's Deus Ex Machina. I think that's deliberate planning from a writing perspective. And you know how I know that? Because it's JMS. I hate to point this out. JMS is a very particular writer. His writing style is very unique. And anybody who reads comics probably agrees with me on this. I know that's a weird thing to say, but for those of you not aware, JMS is actually quite a prolific writer outside of Babylon 5. And he has written some really good comic book stories. He is an excellent writer. He does have a few flaws. There are certain types of stories he struggles with, and he's not that great of a director, if I'm being honest. He has trouble pulling a performance out of an actor. But he is a hell of a writer. So I think this is all something that's been deliberately laid up and dominoed, basically. Okay, hang on. We've got Ivanova, okay? Her feeling of powerlessness, and the fact that she's been dwelling on this for some time. That was established. That was in the episode. That's not me reading into it. That was in the show. Okay? We've got the Shadow connection with the Clark administration, the fact that this machine can detect the first ones, and the fact that the Shadows are first. You see how all these pieces actually do fit to make a correct pattern, so when you hit the one domino, the rest go over. So I don't think there's any Deus Ex Machina here. Just my opinion. Also, of course, Drawl makes the comment, a normal human couldn't do that kind of thing. Well, that's okay. We already have this established. Again, this is another domino piece there. Whoops, sorry. There we go. We already have another domino piece saying that, She's a telepath. Very, very, very weak one. But she is still not a normal human. She does still have telepathic abilities, and ergo, still has the ability to be able to do something like that beyond what a normal human could do. Poor Sheridan. Her timing of showing up right then with a naked woman. I'll talk about the naked woman thing in a bit. Believe it or not, that's actually... I don't think the nakedness is part of titillation, believe it or not. I'm sure there's some cynicism involved, but it does serve a literary purpose, I swear. We'll get to that. But first, let's talk about Marcus and Ivanova. I mentioned I'd talk about Marcus. His motif so far has been fairly one note. Don't worry, he'll get more fleshed out later. I know a lot of people think Marcus is their favorite character, but or say Marcus is their favorite character. But we already know duty is basically the one thing, his sense of responsibility is the one thing that really keeps him. He joined the Rangers because of his brother and because of his honoring the pact, basically, the vow, the word he gave to his brother regarding that. The only reason he's here is because of his sense of responsibility. And he showed very clearly his sense of responsibility regarding the pilot who was getting him out in the episode he was introduced. Do you remember that? Here... Remember, Marcus is the one who disagreed with this mission to begin with. He didn't want to be here. He thought it was stupid and foolish and, well, dangerous, to be blunt. And he's the one who is going to volunteer for the aid because he is one who fits the requirements. He can speak Minbari. I mentioned also the idea that he cuts through Ivanova so quickly because the other motif, and this will become more apparent later, but it's obvious even now, is that Marcus is very perceptive. He's the kind of person who sits in the background for the most part and watches. Always be wary of that kind of person. And he's just kind of perceiving, and he's able to cut through the crap very quickly with several people. And he does it on several occasions. This thing with Ivanova is just another occasion of such, where he's like, no, look, you're just... Why do you have to constantly busy yourself? Why do you have to, you know... I do have to add, though, that Marcus isn't just a broody misery guts. See, it would have been easy to make Marcus Batman. It would. It would be easy to make him just this dark, brooding person who's brooding and dark and brooding and serious all the time. You know, the cool thing, right? But he's not. I mean, he certainly is brooding and he certainly is dark, and he's got that, you know, sit back and watch mentality. But he's also a snarker. In fact, it's funny because he's so much of a snarker. I've always had the impression, personally, that Marcus isn't actually that much of a brooder at all. He is, in fact, an introvert. Now, to explain what I mean by that, an introvert is... I probably am using the wrong term here because I'm kind of tired, forgive me, but what I mean specifically is the kind of person who doesn't want to be expressive and outgoing all the time, but still values connections with other people. In other words, he's not a loner. He doesn't want to be over in his corner left alone, but he doesn't want to be the kind of guy who constantly is running around talking and interacting with others. You with me? I believe I'm using the term correctly, introvert. Forgive me if I'm using it wrong. But I mention this because you can tell underneath there he's a bit of a goofy person, for lack of a better term for that. There's this great line when he and Ivanova are basically facing certain death, and he's smart enough to recognize the severity of the threat that the walkers present. They're never actually named in the show, the walkers of Sigma 957 or whatever. I'm just going to call them the walkers. He's smart enough to recognize the significance of the threat and be like, okay, this is bad. And then at one point they establish that at least they understand our language, they just choose not to speak it. And without any hesitation, it just blurts out, I didn't realize they were French. I burst out laughing at that. No offense whatsoever, of course, to any French people. That's not the point. The point is that's such an insight into his character, because he's snarking. He's like, and then like there's like a second pause as he realizes what he just said. Then he's like, sorry. But it's one of a very small number of insights into the Marcus that is underneath the dark, broody exterior. And I like that. That's actually all I have to say about that. Although I do find it interesting how Ivana is basically able to bait them into pledging aid. And I don't feel like this is spoiling because this is Babylon fricking 5. They will actually aid them before the end. It would have been easy very easy, actually, to have this plot thread never come back. Have them just be something that happens in the background. You know, there's no need to showcase it, but they actually bothered to show it, and I like that. I like that they bothered to show the callback, the continuity here. Anyways, let's talk about the Ministry of Peace, which I don't actually want to talk about because it's kind of horrifying. So some people, some horrible, horrible people, have one of my videos just got copy-wronged. For a song. It was the typo exploration. Let's talk about Zach first. There's two things that are interesting about Zach. First of all, his stilted conversation is amusing to me. I think that's mostly the fault of the actor or possibly the director. He never really feels natural to me. All of his dialogue feels great, but the way the actor presents it just pulls me out of it. I found myself more often than not basically closing my eyes or not looking at the actor so that I could just hear the lines and perceive the performance rather than seeing how he's actually portraying it. I just didn't care for his performance overall. But what I love about it, his first scene is he's concerned about his love life. Now that actually comes in later, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But that's the whole point, isn't it? This is a normal guy. That's the point being conveyed. This is an ordinary, you know, just soldier. He's very, very low. He's actually not even a soldier. He's a guard. Security. So he's law enforcement, in other words. He's a cop. And he's just kind of concerned about his next date. And he's complaining about his uniform not quite fitting. And no matter how many times he gets it sent back, it just doesn't quite fit. Now, later on in the episode, he kind of makes an advance on... I can't remember her name all of a sudden. Whatever, the Peace Witch. What, I've heard her called that before. The woman from the Ministry of Peace. And makes this advance on her, and she turns to him and calls him out for the fact that his uniform isn't fitting. Now, that's a nice little scene in its own right, and it kind of helps to emphasize two very, very horrifying points. First of all, a normal, ordinary person who's just kind of concerned about their love life and normal, down-to-earth concerns, what I'm going to eat next week, how I'm going to make the bills, you know, all those normal things, is exactly the kind of person who would become a part of the Ministry of Peace. He's got the armband on. Some viewers have actually called out the severe similarities between the Gestapo and the Ministry of Peace. And there are some definite, deliberate parallels there. But I agree with JMS when he calls out the fact that that's just one of the most obvious examples in recent history. It's not that hard to find other parallels to the Ministry of Peace in history. And one of my favorites that JMS himself calls out is Mccarthyism. Now, that's kind of fallen out of common knowledge nowadays. I don't really hear that referenced as much as I do. You know, Nazis are still a thing that are referenced to this day. But you don't really hear about the Mccarthyism and the Red Scare referenced as much as you used to, at least here in the States. For those of you not aware of what I'm talking about, it's actually kind of a complicated, long investment thing. But basically, there's a gentleman named McCarthy here in the United States who was basically making his own Gestapo of sorts in anti-communist scare tactics. He was a fairly horrible person, and some pretty horrible stuff was done under his reign until he was thankfully revealed to be the terrible person he was, and everyone moved on from that. There was a fairly critical moment when people saw what kind of a person McCarthy was. He was effectively a bully, and that just kind of broke the momentum of his movement. But I point that out because here's the subtlety of this. So Zach, of course, is the kind of person, like I said, who would become a part of either movement, right? But the other subtle part is that Zach's uniform doesn't fit. There's 2 points connecting these things. First is his comment about his love life, connecting him hitting on her, so you're automatically mentally connecting that point to the previous point. Good writing, JMS. Second of all is the fact that he doesn't fit. He isn't really a Ministry of Peace member. He doesn't really buy in with the lockstep that they're trying to push. But he doesn't really fit with the others either. Garibaldi does not trust him enough to tell him what's going on. He has not been brought into the Army of Light, and he is not really on the side of the good guys either. He doesn't fit. His uniform doesn't fit. It's so brilliant the way that's presented. It's even better because the woman, whose name I can't remember, actually flat out tells him, your uniform doesn't fit, go get it adjusted. That is so... It's a weird combination of subtle and blatant. I love it. But then there's the other interesting thing. So, the Ministry of Peace lady, I actually have her name written down as Ministry of Peace lady. There's no subtlety whatsoever in the way she presents her anything. She isn't subtle to Sheridan, she isn't subtle to Zach, and she isn't subtle at the meeting. 2 notes about that. First of all, 3 notes actually, but whatever. 2 notes that really matter. First of all, that's been Clark's way from the beginning. Clark hasn't been subtle. He hasn't been trying to arrange a situation where he slowly manipulates things from behind the scenes to the point where you don't even realize Clark's the person. I mean, to put it bluntly, Clark is not a Palpatine. Clark is not the kind of person who is able to maintain anonymity while manipulating everyone else. But the other thing that's interesting about that is that's true to real-life history, isn't it? JMS, again, this is the third point was that this was a deliberate writing point. JMS went on a speech about this during one of his interviews at a convention, yeah, it was at a convention, where he talked about, some people called him out saying, this is really obvious. Why is everyone listening to her being blunt and obvious about how she wants to stomp on everyone's freedoms and oppressions? Because that's how that has happened in real life. We have visual and audio evidence from the era of World War II and the McCarthyism thing, both specific examples that were called out with the Nazis and with McCarthyism, where these people blatantly and openly accused Jews of not really being human. Blatant, obvious lies. Blatant, over the top, no subtlety whatsoever. Just, this is the party line. You don't have to be subtle in order to do something like that. All you need is to have enough pieces that are loyal to you, and Clark has a lot of the government loyal to him. He is effectively forming a dictatorship, and politically speaking, a dictatorship is founded on the idea that the dictator keeps his immediate supporters happy, right? And those immediate supporters are all the people who he has amongst, the various elements of the government who wanted more personal power. So Clark is willing to grant them that personal power if they in turn keep him in power. And that actually goes down the line too. They then have to keep their people happy, and they have to keep their people happy, etc. He is forming a dictatorship as opposed to other forms of government, which I'm not going to get into because it's a big complicated topic. There's no subtlety because it's not needed. Note, again, with the Zach thing, when she pretty much flat out says, I need you to spy on Sheridan. Oh, just until he comes to our way of thinking. He's shocked at the thought, because it doesn't even occur to him that he is effectively part of the Ministry of Peace and what that means. And yet through this episode, he is starting to realize what that means. That is hammered in several times. And the irony is when he goes to Garibaldi for some clarification, Garibaldi doesn't really reach out to him back. Because Garibaldi's disgusted by the Ministry of Peace, as he should be, I might add. But then he allows that disgust to bleed over to Zach. Remember, Zach didn't sell out the group. He could have. He could have talked about the issues with Code 7R or whatever, and he could have said, yeah, they're on some secret meeting that I don't know about, and they're doing secret stuff that I don't know about. He could have ratted out his superiors and his comrades to the Ministry of Peace, and he doesn't. Because he's not fully lock in step with the Ministry of Peace. There's a character there who's torn between what's going on. And it's worth noting that it becomes obvious by the end of this episode that Zach is afraid. He still doesn't rat them out by the end. But it's starting to become more and more likely because he doesn't know what's going on the side of his friends. Or I shouldn't call them his friends, but the good guys, right? He doesn't know what they're up to. He knows they're up to something, but he doesn't know what. But he's also afraid of what the Ministry of Peace will do if he doesn't keep in line with them. Do note, this is a brilliant part, and I give credit, I don't give credit a lot to directing in Babylon 5. Usually it's actually one of Babylon 5's weaker points. But I give credit to the director because the director flat out said to several of the extras during the meeting, the Ministry of Peace meeting, look disturbed. look like this bothers you. But he didn't say that to every extra, just some of them. After all, that's how that works, isn't it? Once we have you on board, once we have, it's like, oh, yes, we would just want to be the Ministry of Peace. Okay, we've got about 1,000 people here. We want to cut down on people's freedom of speech. Oh, what's that? 300 people disagree with that? Let's get rid of those 300 people, and now we're left with 700 people who are totally okay with the freedom of speech. Let's lock down even more. Let's say we want to make sure that everyone thinks and says the same thing. Oh, we just lost another 50 people. Get rid of those 50 more people. Think about it. I like how Sheridan cuts through all of her double talk extremely quickly. She constantly has this pattern of speech where she says, I'm saying what she's actually saying. We want this. This is what we actually want. But it's okay because of this. We're going to cut through these things. But it's all right because of this. We are in charge here, and this is sedition, but it's only sedition for the time being, and then we'll be back to the status quo. She does this back and forth constantly. She tries this with Sheridan. He doesn't buy any of it. He doesn't buy it for a single second. And he comes straight off. He is Sheridan to her. He comes off the hard line. He's like, nope, I'm not dealing with this. And it's not until he has a moment to pause and think that he realizes, okay, I need to come back at this as if this was a real threat. Because it's Sheridan's overall approach to immediately say, no, that's wrong. And then, after he's had a moment to think about it, be like, all right, fine, it's wrong, but I have to play the game because I have no choice. He's actually, in many ways, a lot like Cisco, and I don't want to parallel DS9 to Babylon 5. I actually plan to talk about that at some point, probably when we get to DS9. Let me just go ahead and say right now that I don't think B5 and DS9 have that much in common. Not really. I'll talk about that when we get to DS9. I also like how she flat out says things that might as well be straight from 1984. If the state says 4 plus 4 equals 5, then 4 plus 4 equals 5. She literally says that, oh, there's no homeless people. There's just people who've been redefined as no longer homeless. If the state has promised anybody a job, therefore if you don't have a job, you are not seeking it. And so forth and so on. She preaches that particular type of dogma of whatever the state says goes. Also, there's a line there that just really bothers me about how she mentions how she tries to layer her arguments. She says something like, well, this, therefore this, and this, therefore this. And all of these are lies, but because of the conclusion of all these lies, therefore she gets to her real point. For example, she talks about the mentally unstable, she talks about the homeless, she talks about the prejudice and whatnot, and she leads all of that to the final thought that, oh no, crime has been mostly solved. The only criminals left are the mentally unstable. And she'd previously established that the only people who are mentally unstable are those who would question the state because of the whole, if you have a job thing. And then she adds that there's a re-education program being put forth, a re-socialization program. If that isn't terrifying, I don't know what is. She also basically calls out the Mars situation. Oh, I guess there's the whole Mars people don't really like us, but that'll only end when the Mars people stop being stupid. There's nothing anybody else can do about that. Also, the seduction thing. I thought about saying something here. I've decided not to. But it has to do with my personal experience with seduction. Let's just leave that out of this. But all I'm going to say is that there's something wonderfully in character about how she tries to seduce Sheridan. It's the same approach she's been doing to everything else. Literally. Lies to establish, and then total bluntness. She hasn't been subtle. There's nothing subtle about walking up to someone and stripping and saying, let's go. She just takes off her clothes right in front of him. Think about that for a moment. That is very appropriate to her personality type. And what's funny is this is yet another episode, and this is a recurring theme that I've mentioned before, and will come up again in the future, about how the Clark administration is confused at how much Sheridan is not on board with them. Everything about Clark's record, from their perspective, on the surface, or I said that wrong. Everything about Sheridan's record, on the surface, indicated to the Clark administration that he was the perfect pro-Clark person, pro-humanity person to be put in charge of Babylon 5. But of course, as we've already established, and General Haig established, as soon as you go under the surface, you start to see a little bit more about the real person that Sheridan is, and he's very much not the person that is pro-Clark administration. So this is just yet another example of how confused the Clark administration is getting about how much Sheridan is not playing ball when he should be. He should already be on our side. This is weird. Last thing I want to mention, though, this is again going with regards to the way that she talks about it. This is the last thing I have to say. During her Ministry of Peace meeting, she uses this, the way she says things. I rewatched the scene twice because it was very well crafted, the writing of it, JMS writing. The way she says things, so or the method, the word choice and the sentence structure. First, she hits with the hammer. We're going to be locking down. We want to make sure that nobody speaks ill about the government. And then we want to make sure that nobody publishes things. We're going to be, going through things, and we're locking down on freedom of speech and all that stuff. She hits right off the head with that. People obviously are like, whoa! And then she starts trying to smooth things over a little bit, saying the whys and the wherefores. And she mentions, truthfully, bluntly, no subtlety, about how certain terms have been redefined. Certain things have been rewritten, and certain laws have been rewritten, so it's okay. What you're doing is still legal. I mean, your adherence is to legality, right? Not to some stupid concept of right and wrong. And therefore, because this is now legal, it's okay. Then, not too long after mentioning that laws have been redefined and definitions have been redefined, she accuses several people back home of sedition, treason, and spying for aliens. Think about those 2 points side by side. She doesn't have to flat out say, we have called in people because they're people that were problems, but she effectively does say that. And you can tell, as I mentioned earlier, by the opinions and the reactions of some of the people there, that they realize what she has just said. And again, very, very, very blunt. Things are getting worse. I don't know if things will get better anytime soon. For now, I'll see you next time, guys.
you.